The wind tasted like rust and the coming rain. It bit at his exposed skin, sharp and indifferent. Ethan stood on the bridge, high above the black ribbon of water below, and counted. Not sheep, not stars, but seconds. The last few seconds. He could feel the vibration of passing traffic to the concrete beneath his worn soles, a faint, persistent hum that felt like the world's flatline. 2 a.m., or maybe 3. Time had dissolved into a shapeless, gray mass months ago, leaving only the present moment. This bridge, this height, this decision. The railing was cold beneath his gloved hands, rough metal biting to the thin fabric. He leaned forward just slightly, the air rushing past his ears, trying to imagine the fall, the speed, the impact, the nothingness. He saw not his past, but the absence of a future, the empty apartment waiting back in the city, a sterile box filled with the ghosts of ambition and connection, unopened mail piling up on the counter like accusations, a framed medical license turned face down in the corner, a relic of a life built on competence and control, now utterly lost, the wilting succulent on the windowsill, a slow, silent death mirroring his own. He'd been a doctor, an emergency surgeon, hands that could stitch together torn arteries, hearts that had momentarily stopped. He could bring people back, accept himself. The irony was a bitter pill he couldn't quite swallow, even now. He devoted his life to fighting death, only to arrive here, inviting it. The thought didn't bring peace, just a cold, detached resignation. It felt less like a choice and more like an inevitability, the final, logical conclusion to a complex equation that had finally balanced out to zero. He tightened his grip, preparing to hoist himself over. The wind howled louder, a mournful sound that seemed to acknowledge his intent. He closed his eyes, picturing the fall, the brief, terrifying exhilaration, the merciful oblivion of impact. Then, a sound that didn't belong. Not traffic, not wind, but a small, sharp noise. A sob? He froze, opened his eyes. Further down the bridge, huddled against the same railing, was a figure, small, hunched, facing away from him. A girl, teenager, by the looks of it, though it was hard to tell in the dim, sodium vapor glow of the bridge lights. His carefully constructed moment shattered. Irritation flared, sharp and unwelcome. Not now. This was his end, his quiet departure. He stayed still, hoping she wouldn't notice him, hoping she would just go away. But she didn't. She lifted one leg tentatively, resting her foot on the lowest bar of the railing, her body language mirroring his own intent. A different kind of cold washed over him. Recognition. She was here for the same reason. He shouldn't interact. He knew the protocol. Call a hotline, call emergency services. Detach. But he was already detached from everything else. And seeing her, a young life teetering on the edge, felt like a grotesque parody of his own. He took a step toward her. His boots echoed slightly on the concrete. She flinched, startled, spinning around. Her face was pale in the dim light, eyes wide and red-rimmed. He saw fear there, but something else too, a raw, desperate vulnerability that twisted something tight in his chest. "Hey," he said, his voice rough and used. She stared at him, frozen, like a deer caught in headlights. "Don't," she whispered, her voice thin and shaky. "Don't what?" "Don't talk to me." He stopped a few feet away. "You shouldn't be here." A bitter, humorless laugh escaped her. "Neither should you." He didn't deny it. "Are you?" He couldn't finish the question. Her chin lifted slightly, a flicker of defiance amidst the despair. "Yeah." He ran a hand over his face, suddenly exhausted. "Look, there are other places." "Why?" "So you can have the bridge to yourself." Her voice was laced with teenager's sharp sarcasm, a defense mechanism as flimsy as his own. He ignored the jab. "Just come down from there." "Why?" she repeated, louder this time. "Give me one good reason why." He had none. Not one he believed himself. Anyway, what right did he have to tell anyone else to live? Before he could fumble for a response, a new sound cut to the wind and the traffic hum. Distant at first, then growing rapidly louder. Sirens. Multiple ones. Red and blue lights began to pulse in the distance, visible over the city skyline. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. Not the existential dread that had brought him here, but a primal, animal fear being caught, of intervention, of being pulled back into the mess he was trying to escape. He didn't want to be seen like this. He didn't want to be saved. He glanced at the girl. She was staring at the approaching lights, her face a mixture of fear and confusion. "They're coming," he said, the words urgent. He didn't wait for her response. Turning sharply, he scrambled away from the railing, away from her, away from the approaching sirens. He ran towards the nearest bridge exit, adrenaline surging through his veins, the taste of rust and defeat heavy on his tongue. He didn't look back. His carefully planned ending had been interrupted, not by a newfound will to live, but by the messy, inconvenient intrusion of another person and the fear of consequence. He ran back into the night, a failed suicide attempt replaced by the ignominy of a failed escape. The ceiling tiles were the first thing that came into focus. White, fluorescent lit, a grid of mundane squares stretching into a blurry infinity above him. It was wrong. So utterly, profoundly wrong. He wasn't supposed to see ceiling tiles anymore. He was supposed to see nothing. A thick, rubbery tube snaked out his mouth, taped crudely to his cheek. It felt alien, violating. His throat burned, a raw, scraped sensation. His limbs felt heavy, disconnected. A symphony of beeps and clicks surrounded him, a chaotic rhythm of machines he recognized intellectually but couldn't process emotionally. He tried to move his head, a slow, heavy effort like pushing through tar. A dull ache pulsed behind his eyes. Every breath felt shallow, restricted by the tube. He was tethered, trapped. Panic, cold and small, began to bubble up beneath the layers of lingering numbness. Where was he? What had happened? The bridge, the cold, the girl, the sirens, the running. Then darkness. Now this white, beeping, the insistent, rhythmic whoosh of a ventilator. He tried to speak, to ask, to demand. Only a dry, rasping sound escaped, cut short by the tube. A face swam into view, framed by dark hair pulled back tightly, tired eyes sharp and assessing, a firm mouth set in a no-nonsense line. Scrubs. A nurse. She leaned closer, her expression unreadable, a mixture of professional calm and something else he couldn't place. Resignation? Annoyance? "Dr. Cole," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Can you hear me?" Dr. Cole. The name felt foreign, belonging to someone else, a ghost of the past. He managed a slow nod, the effort sending a dizzying wave through his head. She checked the monitors, adjusted the dial on the machine beside him. Her movements were economical, efficient. She didn't offer comfort, didn't smile. She met his eyes again, and in their depths he saw it, a weariness that went bone-deep, home by countless nights spent fighting battles like his. "You're lucky," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "We got to you in time." Lucky. The word hung in the air, sterile and absurd in this white box of forced survival. He managed to turn his head slightly more, enough to really look at her. "Nurse. Or maybe ICU?" Her badge was out of sight. He gathered what little strength he had, ignoring the burning in his throat, pushing past the physical paralysis. He needed to say it. The truth. The only thing that felt real in this fog of confusion. He croaked, the sound painful and raw around the tube, a strangled whisper forced out by sheer will. "Luck," he managed, the sarcasm a thin, brittle shield. He paused, taking a ragged breath through the ventilator. "Isn't the word I'd use." Her expression didn't change. Her eyes held his, steady and unyielding. She didn't offer platitudes or false sympathy. She simply stated a brutal truth, one that landed like a blow in his disoriented state. "You don't get to leave," she said, her voice low, resonant with authority and a hidden pain, "while the rest of us fight to stay." The words were a challenge, an accusation, a gut punch. They stripped away his despair, his self-pity, and exposed something raw and ugly beneath. He hadn't just tried to end his own life. He had disrupted the lives of others, forced them to spend their precious time and energy pulling him back to a reality he desperately wanted to escape. He was an imposition, a burden. He stared at her, unable to respond, the full, unwanted weight of his survival crashing down on him. He was in a hospital bed, surrounded by machines, bound by tubes, pulled back from the brink by people who fought for lives. Lives he had abandoned. The sterile white room felt less like a place of healing, and more like a prison. He was alive, and the crushing certainty of that fact was almost as unbearable as the despair that had driven him to the bridge in the first place. The fight, it seemed, had just begun. Rosa Mendez's words hung in the sterile air like the metallic tang he could now taste at the back of his throat. "You don't get to leave," she'd said, her voice quiet, but carrying the weight of every life she'd fought for, every loss she'd witnessed, while the rest of us fight to stay. He couldn't respond. The tube choked off any sound, but even if it hadn't, he wouldn't have known what to say. Shame? Anger? Resignation? It was a tangled knot in his gut, cold and hard. He was a burden, a complication, a failure, even at dying. Hours blurred. The beeping machines were the constant, monotonous soundtrack to his forced existence. The ventilator pushed air into his lungs with a rhythmic whoosh, a function his own body had apparently given up on. Every breath was a reminder of his attempt, of the intervention. The lines running into his arms felt like chains, tethering him to the sterile reality. There was a cold, deep ache in his abdomen, the lingering protest of his organs. Rosa came and went. She checked his vitals with practiced ease, adjusted drips, charted on a computer at the foot of the bed. She spoke little, her face a mask of professional focus. When she had to suction the tube, a procedure that felt like drowning from the inside out, she was clinically efficient, offering no apologies, just concise instructions. "Breathe deep, cough if you can." It was brutal, necessary, and utterly dehumanizing. He was a body, a case, no longer Ethan Cole, the surgeon, the man, just a set of vital signs stubbornly refusing to flatline. There were other nurses, too, other faces blurring in and out of the harsh light. But Rosa was a constant. She had been the first face he truly saw, the first voice that cut through the fog. There was something about her stillness, her contained energy, that was both comforting and deeply unsettling. She wasn't easy on him, but she was present. Then came Mia. He heard her before he saw her, a hushed, urgent conversation at the nurse's station, her voice tight with barely suppressed emotion. When she finally entered the room, scrubbed into a gown, her face was a roadmap of the night's trauma. Exhaustion etched around her eyes, a tremor in her hands that belied her paramedic's training. Seeing her in this context, the roles reversed, her the healthcare provider, him the patient, was jarring. Mia, always a pragmatic, grounded one, forced to confront the fragility of her brilliant older brother. Her relief was palpable, a wave washing over her face when she saw his eyes open, his conscious acknowledgement. But beneath it simmered something else. Fear, yes, but also a raw, furious pain. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice cracking. She reached for his hand, hesitated, then gently enclosed it in hers. Her touch was warm, a stark contrast to the cold professionalism of the hospital staff. He tried to squeeze back, a weak, fumbling gesture. "God, Ethan," she choked out, tears welling in her eyes. "The bridge. Lena, when dispatch called. I thought—" She couldn't finish the sentence. The implication hung heavy in the air. She, the one who responded to these calls, had almost responded to her own brothers. He wanted to tell her he was sorry. Sorry for the fear. Sorry for the mess. Sorry for existing. But the tube, all he could do was look at her, a silent plea for understanding he knew he hadn't earned. "Why?" she asked, the anger beginning to surface, overriding the initial relief. "Why, Ethan? After everything? Dad, you saw what it did to us. How could you do this?" The mention of their father, the shared, buried trauma, landed like a physical blow. Their father, the war medic who saved countless lives only to lose the battle for his own, leaving behind a wreckage of grief that had shaped both their lives. Ethan's path into medicine had been a direct, unspoken response to their father's failure to save himself. And now, he had mirrored that failure, magnified it. He couldn't answer. The questions hung between them, vast and unbridgeable. Mia stayed for a while longer, talking haltingly about finding his apartment door forced open, the the fear, the desperate hope they weren't too late. Her presence was a painful reminder of the life he had abandoned, the people he had hurt. Days blurred into nights. The tubes came out, a moment of agonizing discomfort followed by the simple, profound relief of breathing on his own, tasting air that wasn't filtered through plastic. His throat remained raw, his voice a weak, raspy whisper. He was encouraged to sit up, to walk a few steps, his body protesting the return to function. The conversation shifted from immediate survival to what came next. The hospital wasn't equipped for long-term mental health care. There was talk of transfer, of evaluation, of programs. He felt like a problem to be solved, a box to be ticked in the system's flowchart. The day he was moved from the acute care floor felt like another step away from the world he knew, another step deeper into the anonymous machinery of recovery he didn't want. The new ward was quieter, the urgency replaced by a low hum of mundane sadness. Other patients shuffled in the hallways, their faces blank or etched with their own private struggles. He was just another case, another statistic in a different database. He missed the grim, honest efficiency of the ICU. Here it felt like waiting to be told what was wrong with him, waiting to be fixed when he didn't believe he could be. His physical recovery was progressing, unwelcome as it was. His body, the traitor, was stubbornly healing. Now came the next phase, the attempt to mend a mind he believed was irrevocably broken. He was being discharged from the acute care hospital, transferred not to freedom, but to a mandated outpatient program. He was still tethered, just by different kinds of chains. The hospital, for now, was done saving his body. The real work, the work on the parts of him that wanted to die, was about to begin, and he faced it with a profound, weary dread. The therapy office was unremarkable, not cold and sterile like a hospital, but not overtly comforting either. Neutral walls, bland artwork, two comfortable chairs facing each other across a low coffee table. It was designed to be a blank slate, onto which patients would project their pain. Ethan found it aggressively, almost offensively ordinary. He sat in one of the chairs, the fabric soft but unyielding. His body still ached faintly, a physical echo of the past week. His throat was still raw. He felt drained, hollowed out, but the crushing numbness that had coated him on the bridge had lifted, replaced by a brittle irritability and a deep, abiding fatigue. Dr. Fisher White entered the room with a quiet grace that surprised Ethan. He wasn't led or guided. He moved with confident familiarity, locating his chair behind a small desk with practiced ease. Fisher was a man of indeterminate age, neatly dressed, his hands resting calmly on his lap once he was seated. What struck Ethan immediately, something the receptionist had mentioned but hadn't fully prepared him for, was that Fisher White was blind. His eyes, behind simple spectacles, were still and unseeing. A flicker of the old Ethan, the analytical doctor, surfaced. He found himself observing Fisher with a detached curiosity. How did he navigate the room? How did he perceive his patients? It felt odd. A blind therapist. How could someone who couldn't see possibly understand the visible, tangible mess his life had become? The cynicism was a familiar, comfortable shield. Fisher spoke first, his voice calm and warm, without a trace of forced cheerfulness. "Dr. Cole, please, just call me Fisher. Thank you for coming today." Ethan shifted in his seat. Didn't exactly have much of a choice. His voice was still rough, a low rasp. Sarcasm, his default setting when he felt cornered. Fisher acknowledged this with a small, knowing smile. That's often how this journey begins for many. Mandated, pushed, reluctant. That's perfectly all right. We start where we are. Where we are. Ethan looked around the bland room. Where they were was a place he didn't want to be, talking to a man he didn't want to talk to, about a life he didn't want to live. So, Ethan said, forcing the words out, "What exactly is it supposed to accomplish?" My stomach's pumped. My lungs work. The hospital did its job. The hospital addressed the acute physical crisis. Yes, Fisher replied evenly. But there's more to a life than just functioning organs, wouldn't you agree? Especially when that life was actively being rejected. His directness was disarming. Ethan bristled. Rejected? I made a choice. A choice born from profound pain, I imagine. Fisher said gently, but his gaze, though unfocused, felt intensely centered on Ethan. Pain that perhaps felt unmanageable, inescapable. Ethan fell silent. The familiar impulse to shut down, to retreat behind walls, rose up. He wasn't here to dissect his feelings. He was here because he had to be. Look, Dr. White Fisher. Ethan corrected himself grudgingly. I'm a scientist. I deal with data, with outcomes. What happened was a statistically probable consequence of variables. He hated how clinical he sounded, how he was reducing his own attempted suicide to a formula. Fisher tilted his head slightly. And the human variables? The ones that aren't easily quantified in charts. They're messy, Ethan said, shrugging, trying to project an air of detachment, irrelevant to the outcome. Or perhaps, Fisher suggested softly, his voice unwavering, they're the only variables that truly matter to why you ended up on that bridge. He paused, letting the silence hang between them, broken only by the faint tick of a clock on the wall. Then Fisher delivered a line that would echo in Ethan's mind for weeks, the observation that bypassed his intellectual defenses and struck something raw and true at his core. His unseeing eyes seemed to bore into Ethan's very being as he spoke. You're not afraid of death, Dr. Cole, Fisher said, his voice calm and certain. You're terrified of facing what comes before it. The words landed with the force of a physical blow. Ethan flinched internally. Was that true? Was the jump less terrifying than the prospect of living with the guilt, the shame, the failure? The idea of sifting through the wreckage of his life, day by painful day, confronting the invisible wounds that had festered and broken him? He hadn't thought of it that way. Death had seemed like an end to the suffering. Fisher was suggesting it was an escape from the process of living through the pain, from the terrifying work of healing. He stared at Fisher White, the blind therapist who seemed to see him more clearly than anyone else had in years. A chill went down his spine, not from cold, but from recognition. He was here, mandated or not. And this man, this quiet, unseeing man, was already peeling back layers Ethan had spent years constructing. The real work, the terrifying excavation of his past and his pain, had just begun. He was no longer in the sterile, relatively simple crisis of physical survival. He was in the quiet, complex, and deeply frightening landscape of the mind. Fisher White's words, "You're not afraid of death, Dr. Cole. You're terrified of facing what comes before it," were a stone dropped into the still, stagnant pool of Ethan's despair. He left that first session feeling raw, exposed, and intensely annoyed. Annoyed at Fisher for seeing too much with unseeing eyes. Annoyed at himself for the flicker of recognition the words had sparked. The days between sessions were a different kind of purgatory. He returned to the quiet, empty apartment, the air still smelling faintly of disinfectant from Mia's frantic cleanup and the lingering ghost of stale alcohol. The wilting succulent on the windowsill seemed to droop further, a silent reproach. He moved through the hours like a zombie, obligated to the outpatient program, attending group sessions filled with strangers, sharing stories he couldn't relate to or wouldn't. He felt fundamentally different from them. His failure wasn't addiction or a chemical imbalance. It was a single, catastrophic professional error compounded by a lifetime of emotional repression. Or so he told himself. His interactions with Mia remained fraught. She called daily, checking in, offering practical help he usually refused. The conversations often skirted the edges of what had happened, circling back instead to logistics, appointments, meals, the infuriating hospital bills that were already starting to arrive, the unspoken weight of their father's suicide, the parallel tragedy, hung heavy in the air whenever they talked about getting help or moving on. Neither of them knew how to navigate this new landscape, where Ethan was the one who had shattered the fragile peace. Rosa, he didn't see again. His brief, impactful interaction with her in the ICU was a contained event, but her words, her weary defiance, while the rest of us fight to stay, had lodged in his mind a tiny, irritating grain of sand in the oyster of his self-pity. He returned to Fisher White's office the following week with his guard fully up. He intellectualized, he deflected. He used medical jargon to create distance. He talked about the pressures of the ER, the impossible demands, the flawed system. He painted himself as a victim of circumstances, a cog broken by the machine. Fisher listened patiently, his silence a powerful tool. He didn't argue or contradict. He would simply ask a quiet question that dismantled Ethan's carefully constructed narratives piece by piece. "And what was your role in that system, Ethan? When you say the machine broke you, where did the machine connect your own gears? If it was simply circumstances, why the level of personal despair?" He challenged Ethan's tendency to externalize blame. He wasn't letting Ethan hide behind the system or the stress or even the specific mistake with Daniel Reyes. He was gently, relentlessly nudging Ethan to look at the person who had made those choices, who had carried that burden, who had ultimately decided the only escape was self-destruction. "You were a surgeon, a rescuer," Fisher observed one session, his voice contemplative. "Your father was a medic. It's a powerful legacy, isn't it? This need to save." Ethan stiffened. "It's what we do." "Is it who you are?" Fisher asked. "And what happens when a rescuer can't save? When they make a mistake? Or when they realize the one person they can't save is themselves?" The questions hung in the air, thick with implications that reached back decades, touching the raw, still tender wound of his father's death. Fisher wasn't just talking about Daniel Reyes. He was talking about a pattern, a core vulnerability Ethan had never allowed himself to examine. Ethan felt like a specimen under Fisher's microscopic gaze, his carefully ordered internal world being systematically disassembled. It was painful, exhausting work, and every instinct screamed him to run, to stop showing up, to find a different kind of escape. But something kept him coming back. Maybe it was the mandated program requirements. Maybe it was Fisher's quiet persistence. Or maybe, just maybe, it was that tiny, fragile flicker of an idea that Fisher had planted, that there was something before death that was more terrifying and perhaps, therefore, more worth facing. He was beginning to feel the first stirrings of something other than numbness, a flicker of anger, yes, but also a creeping sense of something else. Discomfort, awareness, the unsettling feeling of being seen when he desperately wanted to remain invisible. He was raw, agitated, less and less able to sink back into the protective fog of despair. He was starting to feel again, and it was terrifying. Then came the message, unexpected, unsolicited, a name he didn't immediately recognize in his phone's inbox, followed by a picture message. His blood ran cold. It was a photo of him, taken from a distance, clearly on the bridge that night, followed by a simple text message. "I know it was you. We need to talk." The name associated with the number, Franca, the girl from the bridge. He stared at the message, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had fled from her that night, a desperate animal escaping capture. He had tried to erase the moment, the witness, but she hadn't forgotten. She had found him. The initial wave was panic. He wanted to block the number, disappear, pull the covers over his head, and vanish. But then another feeling rose up. Annoyance, yes, but also a morbid curiosity. Why? Why was she contacting him? What did she want? Did she know about? The raw, exposed feeling from therapy intensified, just as Fisher was forcing him to confront his internal reality. Franco was a sudden, unavoidable external force, pulling him back to the most shameful moment of his failure. He felt hunted, cornered. A few days later, she appeared. Not in his apartment, but waiting outside the building after a therapy session. She was exactly as he remembered. Young, intense, her eyes holding a depth of pain that belied her age. She didn't shout or cause a scene. She simply stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "Ethan Cole," she asked, though it wasn't a question. He stopped, frozen. There was no denying it. No running now. "Yes," he rasped his throat tight. "My name is Franca," she said, her voice steady, unnervingly calm. She looked him directly in the eye. "From the bridge." He swallowed hard, nodding. And then she delivered the question, simple, direct, and devastating in its implication. "You ran," she stated, her voice gaining a hard edge that mirrored his own earlier sarcasm. "Why?" It wasn't just about the bridge anymore. It was about running from that night, from the consequences, from her. She was demanding an explanation for his abandonment, not just of himself, but of the shared moment of crisis. She was a living, breathing accusation, forcing him to confront the external reality of the chaos he had created. He stood there, exposed under the pale afternoon sun, caught between the relentless gaze of his therapist, pushing him inward, and the determined stare of a girl pulling him back to the scene of his despair. The walls he had built were crumbling, and he had no idea how to stop the collapse. The unraveling had begun. Franca's question, "You ran. Why?" echoed in Ethan's mind long after she finally relented, her expression a mixture of frustration and reluctant understanding when he offered no immediate answer. She didn't push further, not yet, but her presence had been a jarring, unwelcome intrusion, a physical manifestation of the past he was desperately trying to outrun. Standing there on the sidewalk, blinking in the pale afternoon light filtering through the city trees, he felt utterly exposed. Fisher White had seen through his emotional defenses. Franca had seen him at his lowest, most shameful point, and she had followed him. The walk back to his apartment wasn't long, but it felt interminable. Every step was heavy, weighted by the encounter. He saw his reflection in shop windows, a gaunt, tired man with haunted eyes, a stranger in his own skin. He was no longer invisible. He was seen, judged, and now it seemed pursued. He fumbled with his keys outside his apartment door, the simple act feeling clumsy and unfamiliar. The lock clicked open with a finality that echoed in the sudden silence. Stepping inside was like stepping back into a tomb. The air was stale, thick with the smell of disuse and a faint, lingering chemical scent, the ghost of the overdose, forever imprinted on the space. The blinds were drawn, plunging the living room into a dim, dusty twilight. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of light, slicing through a gap in the fabric. He stood just inside the doorway, unable to move, taking an involuntary inventory of the room. It wasn't just an apartment. It was an archaeological dig site of his failed life. On the counter, near the overflowing recycling bin, was a stack of unopened mail. Letters from the hospital, no doubt, detailing bills that would make his eyes water, insurance forms he couldn't face, maybe even communication about Daniel Reyes's case, official inquiries he had ignored, hoping they would just disappear. Each envelope was a miniature accusation, a reminder of the real-world consequences of his collapse. The pressure was mounting, an external force mirroring the internal pressure from therapy and Franca's unexpected reappearance. How long before the letters turned into calls, into demands, into legal action? He felt a fresh wave of nausea. In the corner, near the window, stood the framed medical license. It had been propped against the wall since Mia's visit, turned face down. He walked over to it slowly, his boots echoing on the hardwood floor. He knelt, the movement stiff and awkward, and reached out a trembling hand. He turned the frame over. There he was, Dr. Ethan Cole, smiling faintly in the photo, looking younger, confident, competent. The gold seal glinted in the dim light. The precise lettering spelled out his name, his qualifications, his right to practice. It was a relic from a different lifetime, a different man. That man had steady hands, a clear mind, and a purpose. This man couldn't even manage to end his own life without botching it. He traced the edge of the frame with his fingertip. It felt like touching a ghost. The weight of that former identity was crushing. This license represented everything he had lost, everything he had betrayed, his potential, his reputation, his core belief in himself as a healer. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was the gravestone of his professional life, a life he couldn't imagine ever reclaiming. The thought of having to use those skills again, of having to face patients, of being responsible for a life after what had happened, the fear was paralyzing. But the bills, the mounting debt, the pressure to somehow earn a living was a cold, inescapable reality. How could he possibly return to a high-stakes profession like medicine with this level of internal wreckage? The conflict felt insurmountable. Near the window, perched on a small side table, was the succulent, a gift from Claire years ago. She had chosen it because it was hardy, supposedly impossible to kill. Like him, she had probably thought. Now, it was a withered, brown husk in a terracotta pot, the soil dry and cracked. A few sad, limp leaves clung to the central stem. It was a pathetic sight, a slow, silent surrender to neglect. He hadn't watered it in months, not since, well, Not since before the final descent. It was a perfect, heartbreaking symbol of his own state. Neglected, dying slowly, seemingly beyond saving. He reached out and touched a brittle leaf. It crumbled between his fingers. A wave of profound sadness washed over him, deeper and quieter than the despair that led him to the bridge. This wasn't the violent drama of suicide. This was the quiet tragedy of simply letting things die. He stood there for a long time, the silence of the apartment pressing in on him. It was a different kind of silence than the hospital's sterile hum or the bridge's wind-whipped exposure. This was a personal silence, filled with the echoes of a life lived and lost, a silence that amplified every regret, every failure. He walked through the room slowly, an unwanted tourist in his own home. The bedroom, the unmade bed, the clothes scattered on the floor, mundane details rendered significant by the context of his attempt. The bathroom, the medicine cabinet. He flinched away from it, the memory of fumbling for pills, the desperate, reckless act too raw. Every object in the apartment felt charged with meaning, a reminder of the life he had intended to end. It was all still here, waiting. The sheer persistence of it was overwhelming. The apartment was a physical manifestation of the life he hadn't been able to escape. Later, hours later, he found himself in the kitchen, staring blankly into the refrigerator, empty save for a few ancient condiments and a half-eaten carton of something unidentifiable. Hunger was a foreign concept, but his body, in its stubborn refusal to die, was beginning to assert its basic needs. He closed the door, the click echoing loudly. He couldn't even manage to feed himself. He sank into a chair at the small kitchen table, the hardwood unforgiving. The silence of the apartment felt crushing. He was alone, utterly, completely alone in the physical space, and in the vast, terrifying landscape of his own mind. The external world, therapy, Franca, the bills, was demanding he engage, but the internal world felt like a vast, empty chasm. He thought of Fisher White's words. Terrified of facing what comes before death. This was part of it. Sitting in the silence, surrounded by the wreckage of his life, facing the sheer, daunting emptiness of the future. It was a different kind of terror than standing on the bridge, a slow, creeping dread that settled deep in his bones. The encounter with Franca replayed in his mind. Her eyes, the raw vulnerability that mirrored his own, but also the surprising strength, the determination to seek him out. And her question, "You ran. Why?" It wasn't just a question about the bridge. It was about everything he had fled from. His responsibilities, his grief, his guilt, his own damn self. She saw it or sensed it. Another person who refused to let him hide. He knew, with a sickening certainty, that this wasn't over. The hospital might patch him up. The therapy might chip away at his defenses. But the real work, the real pain, lay here in the quiet, relentless confrontation with the life he had failed to leave behind. The bills would pile up. The hospital would call. Franca would likely reappear, demanding answers he didn't have. And Fisher White would be waiting in that bland office, ready to push him further into the terrifying territory of self-examination. He looked back towards the living room, where the framed medical license lay face up on the floor and the succulent withered by the window, symbols of a past life and a dying hope. They were waiting for him to decide if he would pick up the pieces, or let the silence consume him entirely. The inventory of his emptiness was complete. Now came the agonizing question of what, if anything, he would try to fill it with. The weight felt unbearable. The external pressures were closing in, forcing a decision he wasn't ready to make. The silence wasn't just silence. It was a vacuum threatening to pull him back into the darkness. He had survived against his will. Now, he had to figure out how to simply be. How to want to live when every instinct screamed otherwise. The apartment, silent and empty, felt like the starting line of a race he had already lost. The silence in Ethan's apartment was a living thing, pressing in on him, amplifying the chaotic noise inside his head. Since Franca's confrontation outside therapy, since sitting alone in his apartment surrounded by the silent accusations of unopened bills and a dying plant, the past had stopped being a distant, abstract concept. It felt immediate, invasive. He tried to lose himself in the mundane, making coffee, staring out the window at the indifferent city. But his mind was a fractured landscape, shards of memory glinting in the dim light of his despair. He was scheduled for another therapy session with Fisher White that afternoon. The thought filled him with a familiar dread. Fisher had a way of pulling threads, of asking quiet questions that unraveled his carefully constructed defenses. But today, the unraveling felt like it had already begun, triggered by Franca's determined pursuit and the stark reality of his surroundings. He sat at his kitchen table, a cup of cold coffee in his hands, and stared at a water stain on the wall. The stain morphed, shifted, and suddenly, he wasn't in his quiet apartment anymore. He was back in the relentless, high-stakes chaos of the ER. Flashback. The air thrummed with a low, constant energy. The controlled chaos of an emergency room during a busy Saturday night. Beeping monitors, the screech of gurney wheels, hurried footsteps, voices. Urgent, calm, panicked. The smell of disinfectant, latex gloves, and something faintly metallic, blood. Dr. Ethan Cole, then 33, felt the familiar rush, the adrenaline spike that came with being the eye of the storm. He thrived here, or thought he did. This was where life and death hung in the balance, where his skills meant something, where he could impose order on chaos. A nurse. Overworked, competent, a face he barely registered amidst the blur of shifts, handed him a chart. Male, 16, presented with severe headache, possible migraine. He scanned the chart quickly. Daniel Reyes, age 16, vital stable, mostly, blood pressure slightly elevated, but not alarming in the context of severe pain. Initial assessment notes. Worst headache of his life, photophobia, sensitivity to light, stiff neck. Red flags, yes, but not definitive for something immediately life-threatening like a subarachnoid hemorrhage, unless... He scrolled through the electronic health record, EHR, on the portable terminal. The interface was clunky, prone to freezing, forcing physicians to rely on summary screens and brief notes during peak hours. Time was always the enemy. Every second spent sifting through convoluted digital records was a second not spent assessing the next patient or performing a critical procedure. He scanned the neurological exam section. No focal deficits, the summary read, meaning no obvious weakness, paralysis, or speech issues that would point directly to a stroke or major bleed. Reassuring. Partially, he made his assessment dictated his notes. Given the severe symptoms, he ordered a CT scan to rule out bleed, admitted for pain management and observation for suspected severe migraine or possibly meningitis, though less likely without fever/stiffness. He moved on to the next patient, the urgency of the ER pulling him away. A laceration needed stitching. A suspected appendicitis needed evaluation. A minor car crash victim needed assessment. Hours later, the CT scan came back. Negative for acute bleed. Relief, a brief, fleeting exhale in a relentless pace. He reviewed the chart again before signing the discharge papers, recommending follow-up with his primary care physician if symptoms persisted after pain management. Standard procedure. Seemed reasonable given the negative scan and the lack of focal deficits. He never saw the full nurse's note buried deeper in the EHR, the one entered hours earlier, before the CT, before the pain medication might have masked subtle signs. The one that read, patient care of persistent unilateral headache, photophobia, noted left pupil sluggish reaction to light at 0.145. A sluggish pupil, a subtle sign of increasing intracranial pressure, easily missed in the chaos, easily buried in a poorly designed EHR, easily overlooked when the summary note stated no focal deficits. A detail that, in retrospect, screamed aneurysm. He signed the discharge papers. Daniel Reyes, age 16, went home. He never saw Daniel again. End flashback. Ethan flinched back in the memory, the cold coffee sloshing over his hand. His apartment snapped back into focus. The water stain was just a water stain, but the image of that chart, the digital interface, the signature on the discharge papers, it was seared into his mind. The mistake. It wasn't a grand, dramatic error. It was a failure of attention, a flaw in the system, a moment of exhaustion, an oversight that had cost a life. The banality of it was almost as crushing as the consequence. He scrubbed a hand over his face, the stubble rough against his palm. He hadn't just misread a chart. He had misread a life. The memory faded, but the feeling lingered. The guilt was a physical weight in his chest, heavy and suffocating. He got up from the table, restlessly pacing the small living room. He avoided looking at the medical license, at the plant. They were too potent, too painful. He needed to do something, anything, to outrun the invading memories. He picked up the remote, mindlessly flipping through channels. A news report about hospital funding. A medical drama with heroic doctors saving lives. He quickly shut it off. It was too much. His eyes landed on the stack of mail on the counter. He hesitated, then approached it as if it were a bomb. He picked up the top envelope. Hospital logo. His name. He took a deep breath and opened it. The numbers swam before his eyes. Itemized bills stretching across multiple pages. ICU stay, tests, medications, physician fees. The total at the bottom was staggering, a number with too many zeros. It was impossible. He didn't have that kind of money. His savings were depleted. He hadn't worked in months. Another bill, another, all from the hospital. They had saved his life, and now they were demanding payment. It felt like a cruel, cosmic joke. The phone rang, startling him. He stared at it, his heart pounding. An unknown number. Was it the hospital? A collection agency already? Or Franca? He let it go to voicemail. He couldn't handle another confrontation, another demand. The phone stopped ringing. A moment of silence. Then a notification. Voicemail. He listened with trepidation. It wasn't the hospital. Or Franca. It was a polite, firm voice from Human Resources at his former research institution. They were following up on his extended leave of absence. They needed him to provide a return date, or they would have to discuss his future employment status. The message was clear: come back or you're fired. His job as a medical researcher felt a million miles away. He couldn't face the sterile labs, the forced collegiality, the pretense of normalcy. But he needed money. He needed health insurance. The pressure was tightening its grip. Return to a toxic environment that reminded him of everything he had lost, or face financial ruin on top of everything else. It felt like another trap. He sank onto the sofa, the unopened bills scattered on the coffee table like fallen leaves. The weight of the external world was pressing in. The hospital wanted money. His job wanted decision. And Franca wanted answers he didn't know how to give, reminding him of the life he had failed to save and the life he had failed to end. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the physical reality of the apartment, the bills, the dying plant, the framed license. But the memories wouldn't stay contained. They were fragments, pieces of shattered mirror, reflecting the moments that had led him to the brink. Another memory surfaced, colder, more clinical. The hospital legal department. A hushed, sterile conference room. Dr. Helen Carter, the chief of medicine, sat across from him, flanked by hospital lawyers. Her smile was thin, her eyes cold and assessing. "Ethan," she'd said, her voice smooth and condescending, "we understand this is a difficult time. Patient outcomes, they're never guaranteed, especially complex neurological cases." Complex? Daniel Reyes's case wasn't complex. It was a misdiagnosis, a simple, fatal oversight. They showed him the chart, the CT report, the autopsy findings, ruptured cerebral aneurysm, the internal review notes. Everything neatly documented, except, "We've conducted a thorough review," Carter had continued, her voice like ice water. While regrettable, the initial presentation was atypical. The negative CT, "These things happen," except the nurse's note, the one detailing the sluggish pupil. It wasn't in the documentation. They showed him. There was a note. He started, his voice weak. About his pupil. Carter's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. One of the lawyers coughed discreetly. "All relevant documentation is here, Ethan," Carter said firmly. "The EHR is comprehensive. Sometimes initial nursing observations are superseded by physician assessment and imaging results." Superseded or deleted? He felt a cold dread creep up his spine. He had signed the discharge. The ultimate responsibility rested with him. But they weren't just exonerating him. They were erasing evidence. Given the sensitive nature, a lawyer chimed in, his voice oily smooth, and the potential for litigation. The family is considering a lawsuit. Naturally, we would like to offer you support, resources, counseling. Support, resources, a euphemism. It was a bribe, a muzzle. In exchange, Carter said, taking over, we would require you to cooperate, which includes refraining from discussing the specifics of this case with anyone outside of this room. A simple non-disclosure agreement, standard procedure in these situations. It protects the hospital, and it protects you. Think of it as. She paused, a cruel twist of her lips. A fresh start. We can weather this. Your career can weather this. As long as we are aligned. Aligned. The word felt like a cage snapping shut. They weren't offering support. They were offering complicity. Sign the NDA. Stay silent about the missing note. Let the hospital control the narrative, and they would protect him from the fallout. Maybe even help him keep his license, his career, refuse, and they would bury him. He looked at their faces, calm, professional, utterly devoid of empathy. They saw him not as a colleague in pain, but as a liability to be managed. He had made the mistake, yes, but they were actively covering it up, making him a party to their deception. The weight of the decision had been crushing. His career, his reputation, his financial future, against his conscience, against the memory of Daniel Reyes's mother's face. He had signed. The memory was a bitter taste in his mouth. The cover-up. He hadn't just been a victim of circumstances. He had been a willing participant in silencing the truth. He had chosen self-preservation over accountability. The shame burned hotter than any physical pain. This was what Fisher meant by what comes before death. This was a rot at the core, the moral compromise that had festered and poisoned everything. He stood up restlessly. He couldn't stay here. The apartment was too full of ghosts, too suffocating with the weight of the past and the pressure of the present. He needed air. He needed something. He walked to the window, pulling back the blinds. The city stretched out below, indifferent and bustling, people living their lives. He felt utterly disconnected from it all. He saw his reflection in the glass, superimposed over the city lights. A distorted image. He looked older, broken. The man in the reflection was a stranger. Another memory, sharper, more personal, pierced through the haze. The fight with Claire. Not a shouting match, but a quiet, devastating unraveling in their shared apartment. The apartment he still lived in, alone now. She had found it. Not the final, drafted suicide note, but an earlier version, hidden in a drawer. His private confession of despair, laid bare on paper. Her face had been pale, her eyes wide with shock and hurt. Ethan, what is this? He had tried to minimize it, to dismiss it as a dark mood, a momentary lapse. But she knew him, or she thought she did. Don't lie to me, she'd said, her voice trembling. This is serious. You're not okay. You haven't been okay for months. He had retreated, built walls, refused to let her in. His default. He was a doctor, the fixer. He didn't need help, especially not from her. He couldn't articulate the depth of his pain, the guilt over Daniel, the suffocating weight of the cover-up. He couldn't admit how fundamentally broken he felt. We need to talk about this, she pleaded. We need therapy, couples therapy, individual therapy, something. He had shut down. I don't need therapy, Claire. I just need time. I'm dealing with things at work. That was it, wasn't it? Always deflecting, always intellectualizing. He could talk about differential diagnoses and treatment plans, but not about the gaping wound in his soul. He could mend bodies, but not hearts, not even his own. Her expression had hardened, the vulnerability replaced by a profound sadness, a sense of finality. You heal bodies, Ethan, she'd said, her voice quiet but devastatingly clear. But you ignore hearts, even yours. And then she was packing, quietly, methodically, gathering her things, gathering the pieces of her life that no longer fit with his. He watched her go, paralyzed by his inability to stop her, by his inability to bridge the chasm he had created between them. That was the breaking point. Not just a note itself, but his refusal to let her in, his inability to accept help, his fundamental brokenness that he couldn't hide anymore. Her leaving hadn't caused his final descent, but it had removed the last fragile anchor tethering him to a semblance of a normal life. It had confirmed his deepest fear, that he was fundamentally unfixable, that anyone who got too close would eventually leave. The memory of Claire's words, her quiet departure, sent a fresh wave of pain through him. The breaking point. It wasn't a sudden snap, but a slow, agonizing erosion of hope, culminating in that final, devastating loss. He was adrift now, buffeted by the storms of his past and the rising tide of present pressures. The apartment was a museum of his failures. The bills were physical reminders of his financial precariousness. The calls and messages were the outside world demanding he re-engage. Fisher White was forcing him to look inward, and Franco was a living echo of the event that had pushed him over the edge, a reminder that even his attempt at oblivion had consequences he couldn't escape. He walked back to the succulent, picked it up gently. It was light, bone-dry. The remaining leaves were brittle, lifeless. Could anything still grow here? Could anything withered and neglected this long possibly be brought back? It felt impossible. He set the plant back down. The silence returned, but it was different now. It wasn't empty. It was crowded with ghosts. The ghost of Daniel Reyes, the ghost of his father, the ghost of the doctor he used to be, the ghost of the life he had shared with Claire. And now, the insistent, unsettling presence of Franca, demanding answers from a man who felt he had none left to give. The unraveling had truly begun. He was caught in the tangled threads of his past, and there was no clear path forward, only the difficult, painful work of sifting through the wreckage. The act of the fall was over. He had survived. But living through the unraveling felt, in many ways, far more terrifying. Watch out for what happens in the next episode. Thank you for watching.